I want to thank Eric and Tori Johnson and the SEC for inviting me to be here. I had the pleasure of meeting the commissioner a couple of weeks ago in Charlotte at the South Carolina-North Carolina football game, and I told him I am an SEC guy. So even though I was born in New York City, my family, my mother's side of the family, the Shalangs and the Parentes, are from New Orleans, so I've got that LSU connection. I graduated from Deerfield Beach High School in Florida, and so I was down in Florida. I used to pull for the Gators. I never had blue and orange sneakers, but I was a Gator fan. Our rival high school from Deerfield at the time was Boca Raton, and the quarterback was Mark Richt at the University of Georgia. My brother was born in Louisville and spent many years in Kentucky. And then, as you heard from Eric, I'm a graduate of the University of South Carolina, proud Gamecock. And then, much to my chagrin, my oldest daughter, Carolina, is now a second semester sophomore at the University of Alabama and really enjoying it. So I'm an SEC guy through and through, and it's just really an honor and a privilege to be here with you all. So as Eric said, you know, I bring a bias to this discussion today, and that is I believe that university-industry collaborations are really good for individuals at universities and the individuals at companies. So I bring that bias, okay? And you're going to hear that kind of wedded through my presentation. I'm going to talk a little fast. That's just my nature. And then I'm going to try to leave some time at the end for Q&A, and I'll be around through the next session, okay? So this was the title that I came up with, Can't Universities and Companies Get Along? Efforts to Improve University Industry Engagement. And as Eric pointed out, that's the focus of our group, and I'll put a little promo slide in at the end about the UIDP. All right, so first of all, just a calibration point. While I believe university-industry collaborations are really important from a financial perspective, the amount of money that companies invest in universities in terms of R&D has been pretty much unchanged for a long period of time. It's about 5% of the overall funding portfolio. So I think if you looked at your schools, whatever school you're at, if you look at your funding portfolio, you're probably in the 5 to 10% range. And that number, once again, has been pretty constant nationally for decades. If you're more than 10%, you're doing something right. And if you're less than 5%, you're doing something that maybe you could look at improving, okay? So just as once again, it's a calibration point. This issue has been around for a long time. I didn't put this in my slide deck, but this issue of universities and companies working better together has been an issue for over 100 years. People have been talking about it and trying to figure out ways to do that. About a decade ago, a group of people were convened by the National Academy and came up with 3 guiding principles for making collaborations better between companies and universities. One of them is you got to support each other's mission. Companies aren't going to work with you because they like you. They're going to work with you because they can get something out of it, and vice versa. You should get something out of working with them. Secondly, if you really want to get a return on investment, focus on long-term collaborations. It takes a lot of work to do one sponsored research agreement or one series of internships, right? But if you build a collaboration, you can really get a lot of return on investment long term. And then the last bullet, and this is actually how our group got started, the UIDP, is it takes too long to negotiate agreements between companies and universities, whether it's for sponsored research, getting access to incubator space, investing in startups, taking a license. It takes too long, okay? So make it easier. So these 3 guiding principles, and that book is available as a PDF on our website. It's actually a good read if you're interested in learning more about how companies and universities should work better together. Okay, so this is a slide I took from 9 Sigma. So while university-industry collaborations are always in a state of flux, there's always issues around them, I will tell you this, companies want to work with universities. And this slide I got from 9 Sigma is a result of a Harris poll that they did. They looked at company CEOs, and they asked questions about, are you willing to work more with external parties to get access to innovation? Will my company use things like prize mechanisms and other things to work with external parties? And as you can see, these are all pretty agreed or strongly agreed. So companies want to work with universities on a whole myriad of issues, not just sponsored research. Okay, I actually had a slide in here that talks about the partnership continuum, about all the ways that companies and universities can work together. I actually took that out of the presentation. But when you're thinking about building a collaboration with a company, you need to think about more than sponsored research because they have a lot of other interests, right, besides sponsored research. All right, so another good data point, and I put this in here for the researchers and the vice presidents of research and the provosts in the room. I get asked all the time, why should we as a university work with companies? How does that help our academic reputation? Well, this is some data from Elsevier, the Scopus report, looking at 4 universities. And I don't know, can you all see that okay? Can you all see that? The purple that's there shows the citation impact when a university researcher and an industry researcher publish together. The green is when there's a U.S. researcher and an international researcher from an academic institution. The red is when 2 different universities collaborate, and the blue is when it's an institutional collaboration. So what does this data point to? This points to the fact that when companies work with universities and publish results, the impact from that is actually very high. It's much higher than interinstitutional or intra-institutional. Okay? So this is a great slide if you're a research leader at a university or an academic officer and somebody scowls at a faculty senate meeting about why we should work with companies. Let me know and I'll be pleased to give you this slide. Okay? All right, so that's just a couple of data points I wanted to give you. Let me give you a little perspective on what I hear from companies that I work with. And I spend a lot of time just visiting, having lunch, talking to company representatives who are involved with external engagement, okay? First of all, and I know you guys don't want to hear this, but for many companies, they view universities as suppliers, okay? Most of y'all do not think of yourselves as suppliers. So I'm going to tell you a little quick story. I used to be in charge of the Research Foundation at the University of South Carolina. We had a researcher, Asif Khan, who made gallium nitride wafers. And I got a phone call from one of the big defense contractors telling me we were named the Silver Supplier of the Year. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Silver, supplier of what? Well, it turned out his research contract involved providing them 6-inch wafers of gallium nitride for wide bandgap materials, okay? That's how that company viewed the University of South Carolina Research Foundation. They viewed it as a vendor, as a supplier, okay? So just something to think about. And my next point is this. While R&D is very important to you as universities, and it's very important to companies, they are always under a lot of stress when it comes to R&D. So a former colleague of mine, Brent Saunders, is now CEO of Allergan. When Allergan was in talks to be bought by activists and all that was going on, there was a lot of talk about getting rid of the wasteful R&D spending at Allergan, that they could make them more efficient. Now, why were they buying Allergan? They were buying Allergan because of their research pipeline, right, to get access to drugs so they could sell them. But that's what it was said in the Wall Street Journal. Get rid of that wasteful R&D spending. So companies are always under pressure to evaluate the return on investment from investments in R&D. Okay? It's just the reality of what's going on. And what I always like to tell my friends in the university sector is this. The people that are representing companies and wanting to work with you, give them a little love, okay? Give them a little love. They are trying inside their companies to get resources to work with you. They're fighting other people in the organization to provide support to you, whether it's financial or other support. So just something to keep in mind. The other thing I want to point out is for a lot of companies, their research investments in universities are actually driven by their HR strategy. So they're making investments in you and your students, typically, because they want to do a test run on how those people are going to perform so they can ultimately hire them. In fact, for some companies, the head of university relations has a dual report. One report to the technology side and then one report to HR. Okay? So don't ever lose sight of that. The greatest intellectual property that you have as a university are your people. All right. I took this slide from a company, it doesn't really matter which one, that talks about how they evaluate universities. So let me give you, just make a couple of points. First of all, in my travels around the world, I've been told that there are at least, by universities, that there are at least 100 universities in the top 20, okay? So a lot of you will meet with a company and say, we are world class. And inside the head, the company's going, maybe not. You might be good, but not world class. So Companies actually use objective analyses to evaluate universities. So they look at things like curriculum, ranking, faculty strength. Some companies actually have algorithms that they use. Some of them employ third parties, okay? So something to think about. That being said, companies want to work with people that are in their area that it's easy to work with. So a couple weeks ago, I was in Cincinnati. Procter & Gamble is working very closely with University of Cincinnati. University of Cincinnati is a really good school. It's not the most preeminent university in the United States, I think, or in the world. We'd all agree with that. But there's some value for them to be able to drive from Mason, Ohio, to the University of Cincinnati, and the University of Cincinnati has shown a willingness to work with them. And I'm going to go back to that in a little bit. The influence of successful alumni cannot be discounted. So if there's a CEO of a company or a CTO of a company, they're going to want to work with their alma mater because it makes them feel better, right, about their place, right? It's just inherent self-interest. Companies also care about demographics. They care about diversity. You'll hear this a lot from companies. They care about success in recruiting. And then this last thing I cannot stress enough. Success in research collaborations breeds success. What's the flip side of that? A bad experience leads to no longer any relationship. And there are companies that will blacklist certain universities. Okay? So I'll go out on a limb here. If you sue somebody, they're not likely to want to do a research collaboration with you. Okay? So you have to evaluate that. Do I want to sue them? What am I going to get out of this, right? All right. What do companies want when they work with you? I think there's some kind of standard things that I see. One is they want predictability without surprises. Okay? Predictability without surprises. They want efficient negotiations. Dow Chemical did a survey of their university research contracting, and it looked like a roller coaster where it started out low in terms of the early number of months it took to negotiate a contract, and then went way up, and then it tailed off. On average, they were in the 9 to 10 month range to negotiate a contract. Now, if you're a researcher, 9 to 10 months is a really long time, right? So make it easier to negotiate contracts. They also want truthfulness, okay? Unfortunately, many folks at universities will tell them, well, we as a university can't do something. And what I would tell you is this. Know the difference between don't want to versus we can't. When you say we can't, that means you can't, right? You can't indemnify somebody if you're a state university. All right? I understand that. If you say we can't restrict publications, you can do a 60, 90-day delay, which most places do, right? You can negotiate foreground intellectual property rights if you want, okay? So be truthful, because what happens is you say to them, we can't, and then they go, well, your colleagues down the road we just did that deal with, and they did it. Why can't you? And then this all relates back to the first 3 points, and that is they want to engage with doers and decision makers. So a colleague of mine used to say, it takes me to talk to 9 people at a university who say no before I find the right person who can say yes. Okay? So stop and think about that. Think about who is engaging companies and who can make decisions. All right? Just think about that. And we could spend, by the way, a whole hour and a half talking about that process, but I'm not here to talk to you about that. I'm here to give you kind of an overview. Tickle your interest, right? So what else are companies doing? Well, they're using tech scouts in some parts of the companies. They're using prize competitions and requests for proposals. How many of y'all have replied to a prize competition? Any of y'all? Have y'all done that? Have y'all done it? Or an RFI? Companies like PepsiCo have RFIs. Samsung has one. They put out I don't remember the acronym for it, but Samsung does an RFI where they put out like a federal agency and they say, hey, look, here are the criteria. Respond if you like. Companies are also making strategic use of master agreements. So they work with you a little bit, they do a little bit of courtship, and they decide, you know what, we've done enough work with this university that let's enter into a master agreement so we don't have to basically start from scratch on every negotiation. I like master agreements, but I will tell you this, they are not the panacea. They are not going to solve your industry engagement issues, But if you have gotten to a point in a relationship where it makes sense to enter into a master agreement, do it. Some companies want you to take IP and put it into the public domain for sponsored research. So the IT companies, okay, go back to my point about being sued. They don't want to be sued, okay? So they want you to put things in the public domain. And then they're also willing to work with you to get government funding. So Eric mentioned we've been on tons of panels. We read those support letters, in the back of the proposals. When you read the same support letter for a $10 million grant application from 10 different companies, and the letters have the same spacing issue in the third paragraph, what that meant was the researcher from the university sent the letter over to the companies and said, can you put this on letterhead and sign it? That doesn't convey the fact that there's a true collaboration. But if you have a good relationship with a company and they write an impassioned letter saying, Dear NSF, Dear NIH, we've been working with the University of Arkansas for the past 3 years. We've hired their students. We found them to be very resourceful. They've helped us solve problems. We're employing more people in Arkansas because of that. We're able to keep jobs in the United States. Those letters matter. So companies are willing to do that. They want you, if they're your partner and you're successful, then that's going to help them be successful, right? It goes back to that inherent self-interest. Okay, one of the real challenges, though, for you is that the university relations folks at companies are always under constant churn, all right? It's not a career path for most company folks. You don't say, you know what, when I join this great Fortune 100 company, I'm going to be involved in university relations, and that's going to help me become the CTO. All right, so it's unfortunate. For a lot of it, when I send out an email to our list, and I get back a message that says, no longer here, I'm always like, oh no, right? Oh no, that's a problem. They either retired, typically if they retire, they tell me, but sometimes they just get canned. And that's a problem for you because you are much more stable in terms of employees typically. All right, I want to put up a quote that was said at our fall 2014 UIDP meeting at MIT. All right, so this was a CTO of a company, and he said, the business model at U.S. universities for industry-funded collaborations is becoming more and more not competitive versus the rest of the world and other options, with some exceptions. Now, I will tell you, a lot of the university folks went into anaphylactic shock when he said this, okay, and they actually challenged him. I found it interesting. They went up to me, they said, well, we don't believe that. And I'm like, really? You don't believe what he's saying to me? Okay? And this is the reality. There are great universities around the world, all over the world. So most companies now are multinational, and they can work with anybody, not just you. If they're in the U.S., they want to work with you if they're based here, but that's not their only option. Some companies have to invest in research overseas because they sell products there. Okay? That's just the reality. And if they're a multinational company, they are not going to make a significant investment in a U.S. university unless the motherland says it's okay. All right? So as great as it is that Mercedes is right outside Tuscaloosa, that's a manufacturing facility. They're doing good work with Alabama. For any substantive decisions, they're going to have to go back to their home and get an answer. Okay? And that's just the way it is. But they can work anywhere in the world. Okay? So just stop and think about that. All right? All right. So what are universities doing? And this slide's pretty busy, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what's on this slide. So universities are not sitting idly by saying, well, companies complain about working with us. We'd like to find better ways to work with companies, but we'll just keep doing the same thing, right? That's not going to work. So what are some universities doing? And I just put up kind of a potpourri of things that universities are doing. So let me go through a few of them. At some universities, and I include Mississippi State and Texas A&M, in certain schools, they are giving credit for industry engagement in T&P. So how do you get faculty interested and motivated in doing things? T&P, right? So this is not going to work across all colleges, but certainly for certain schools, it makes sense. And I would argue, and I would love to have this discussion with any of y'all, getting industry funding is more difficult than getting federal funding. I'll have that debate. Invite me to your campus. I'll debate anybody about that. It's harder to get industry funding than it is to get federal funding. So if that's the case, why don't you give people credit in their T&P for those activities or entrepreneurial activities. So, two of your brethren, Mississippi State and Texas A&M, have looked at and changed their T&P policies in certain colleges. Some universities have set up a one-stop shop for companies to gain access to the university. Companies get very confused. You do not want them going to your website. Okay? So, if you do this well, this can be a real success. I will tell you, we created something called Business Link at South Carolina when I was there in 2003. It was a spectacular failure. Okay? Spectacular. It was a good idea. First of all, it was ahead of its time. But secondly, me, the person in charge at that time of trying to get Business Link up and going, did a terrible job of getting internal buy-in from the various folks. So, had a little bit of a challenge with the business dean. Guess who won? Right? Okay? So, I failed. That was failure of execution on my part. But the concierge model can work very well for you at your institution, and you should evaluate it. All these things up here are things for you to evaluate. I'm not saying do them, but you should evaluate them. Some schools, Georgia Tech right down the road, has a crowdfunding program, okay, for certain types of research. So I don't think I ever give a talk without mentioning my brilliant wife, Laura, okay? So my wife, Laura, is a social roboticist. You can Google her. She's at Yale now, right? Graduate University of South Carolina at Yale. How about that, huh? All right. She does social robotics work with children with autism. That is a great crowdfunding project, right? Why? Because a lot of people care about, they have a kid with autism. Hey, we're going to do a crowdfunding project to build a cheap robot that's going to cost $300. Invest $300 through this Kickstarter or this crowdfunding program. That works. If you're trying to get money to look at the genetic line of a plant, probably not going to be as highly motivating, right? Let's talk about faculty as decision makers. Too often, university administrators don't engage faculty in thinking about the industry engagement process, and you really need to do that. Missouri has looked at that and are engaging it. So talk to Hank Foley. Hank is really ahead of the curve here. If you all don't know Hank Foley from University of Missouri, who used to be at Penn State, you should invite him to come talk, because Hank really knows about industry engagement, and he's a heck of a researcher. CMU has something for faculty startups called Go in Peace licenses. Okay, you should look at this. It basically gives incredibly favorable terms to faculty members to do startups. Okay, do this. These things are not cannibalistic. You don't have to change what you've been doing before, but you can do these as add-ons, right? Increase the number of options available. A lot of schools are monetizing foreground intellectual property, including LSU, where they include that in the contracts. That goes back to eliminating the risk issue that I talked about before. Rochester Institute of Technology has a student contracting program where they do basically capstone projects for fixed price for companies. Those work very well. The data from RIT is very impressive. There are a lot of other schools that do that. Penn State has tried a patent auction. It didn't work out very well. They didn't make a lot of money. But you know what? I think they got a lot of good press for it. Companies responded very well to it, and at least allowed them to then go back to the faculty members who think all their ideas are great and say, well, look, we tried to license your technology. We put it up through a patent auction. Nobody bit. So we're going to stop protecting this in Europe, Brazil, South Korea, China, Japan, and everywhere in the world. Okay? It protects you as an administrator if you're thinking about trying to reduce your patent costs. Alabama, through the Culver House School, has a great student consulting program. This is where they put together a set of published activities that students will do on behalf of companies. And they're consulting groups, and they do things in marketing, journalism, advertising, public relations, etc. If you're not looking at this, you should. And I have some propaganda that I brought with me. If you want, I brought a couple of books that describe that program. I'll be pleased to give with you. And then the last is express licenses. So for some universities, including North Carolina, they've set up programs where companies can print out a license, sign it without altering it, for a certain set of technologies. Now, I will tell you that most companies are not doing this. But once again, what does it show? It shows that the university is being forward-looking, right, in terms of trying to increase the number of options available for licensing. So all these things, you should evaluate them. And I'll be pleased to go into greater depth on any of these with you if you'd like. Be pleased to talk to you all about it. All right, so just some food for thought, and then I'm going to run through a few slides in the last 10 minutes or so. Companies want to know that they can access intellectual property generated from work they funded. Okay? Just stop and think about it. They want to know that they can have access to intellectual property, or at least make a decision on accessing the intellectual property. And then what you hear from universities are, well, tax rules forbid us from giving access to intellectual property that's generated through a corporate-sponsored research project. And yet some schools are doing this, okay? So this is a big bugaboo issue for companies that try to do sponsored research with universities. They'll spend $200,000 at the University of Florida. They'll say, well, look, we want to have an option to the first rights of any of the research, and the university will come back and say, well, we'll give you a non-exclusive royalty-free license. And the company goes, no, we want to be able to know what that technology is. We want to evaluate it, and we want to have first rights at it. Well, we can't do that because of IRS Rev Proc 2007-47, which forbids us from giving you benefits that we don't give other companies. Companies don't like that. They don't understand it. And a lot of universities are now responding to that, okay? We actually did a report, and I actually have copies of this, on these new models for contracting, all right? There's about a dozen schools in the United States that have done this. It removes the IP hurdle. To date, only the public schools have done this. So if anybody here is from Vanderbilt, talk to Alan Bentley, get him to think about doing this, okay? Now, I will tell you, it's too early to evaluate whether or not these programs are generating a lot more revenue. What I can tell you is this. Companies appreciate the fact that universities that are adopting this are trying to do something forward-looking in terms of working with them. All right, what does it do specifically? Well, what it does is in the sponsored research agreement, it adds a clause that says the company gets access to foreground intellectual property. It does it for a price, typically something called a technology fee. So I'll just make this up. Sponsored research agreement between a company and a university for $100,000. The company adds $20,000 on top as a technology fee for all foreground intellectual property that emanates from that sponsored research agreement. The university then holds that as IP revenue until the end of the contract, okay? And in the event that it's Gatorade, right? Because that's what I hear. Well, oh my God, we're giving away, we could be giving Gatorade for 20% of $20,000. Why would we do that? You can put in a bonanza clause that says after so much revenue, a $10 million of revenue, $1 million of revenue, that the company will provide 1 to 2 or 3% royalties after that fact. What this does is this allows the companies to model the investment in the sponsored research and remove risk and uncertainty from a sponsored research agreement. I cannot stress how important this is to companies. They want certainty. And this goes back to the world model that I talked about before. They can go almost anywhere in the world and get this deal without jumping through hoops. Okay? So, you're trying to compete, company like AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca has hundreds, if not thousands of people right next to the University of Cambridge. They're talking to you about doing a research project. And they're spending 3 months going back and forth. And then they have a group meeting on WebEx. Cisco's a UIDP member, by the way. So they do a WebEx, and someone says, well, Dr. Smith over in the Cambridge office has been working with Dr. Jones from the University of Cambridge, and she's really good. Why don't we stop messing around with the University of blank in the United States and do a project here at Cambridge? Right? Right? Think of yourselves, right? Think of yourselves. I fly all the time, right? If you fly and you have a terrible time with an airline, are you inclined to go back and work with them again? Right? No, right? It's common sense. All right. I put this slide up here, and I know you can't read it, and that's okay. These are some important factors I'm going to run through here in the last few minutes of my talk. So, lots and lots of universities and companies have multiple data access points for engagement. This is coming out in a UIDP report that's going to come out next month. And it shows on the left in purple all of the various university people that have corporate engagement somewhere in their title. And it goes from dean's offices, legal affairs, the philanthropy folks, deans, associate deans, faculty members, sponsored research, intellectual property, corporate relations, incubator folks, right? Research park folks. All those people, presidents, board members, all think that they're responsible for corporate relations. And on the other side, you have the same set of issues at companies. There are all kinds of people at companies that think that somehow they have responsibilities for working with universities. This is very challenging, and the reason we did this project is to help provide some illumination on this. What I would tell you, and this goes back to my doers and decision makers, think about, if you evaluate your system, who are the people that should be at the front of engaging companies at the outset. Once there's an engagement and a conversation, then you can bring in all the other folks. It is very confusing when a company gets a phone call from somebody in development saying, "Hi, I'm Tony. I'd like to come visit you. I'd like to tell you about the great research going on at the university." And they go, "Really? Well, I met 2 weeks ago with Eric, and isn't he in your research office?" And you go, "Oh, crap," right? And it's happening more and more because the development folks are now trying to sell research because they can't get philanthropic dollars. They can get investments, okay? So there's actually a whole group called NACRO of all these academic corporate relations officers, and now they all are trying to learn about research. And we could have a whole discussion about that, but that's another time. All right, I want to talk about contracting versus licensing. So I mentioned to y'all that for most universities, industry funding represents around 5 to 10% of their overall portfolio. This is from the University of Florida. Banner year in fiscal year 2015, $706 million in research awards. Now, I don't know their numbers because they don't put it on their websites. Most schools don't nowadays. But I can guarantee you that their licensing revenue isn't 1/10 of that. Okay? So you spend all this time, you spend 90% of your time negotiating intellectual property rights in a sponsored research agreement, and yet at least 90% of the revenue that you're generating is coming in through sponsored research. So maybe you've misplaced your priorities, right? That's why some schools, like Penn State, have said, you know what, let's not worry about, we're not getting any money. In fact, it's costing us money. Let's focus on sponsored research and think about the IP office as a faculty service office, which, by the way, is how I think you should think about the IP office. Not as a revenue generator, but as a faculty service office. So I'm not going to read through this. There's been a study done by Brookings looking at IP offices. The vast majority of them lose money. The vast majority of them. In this study, over 87% didn't even break even. So yes, there's Columbia that makes money. You'll have, a successful license that'll generate a lot of money. That's great, but then it goes away. So, we're at an SEC conference. I'll pick at Florida State, okay? They had the Taxol. They got $50 million a year for 15 years. They were number 2, number 1, number 3 on the autumn rankings all that time. Taxol went away. You know where they wound up? Below 100, because they only had like 2 or 3 licenses generating any revenue. The other 2 were really small, okay? Sponsored research doesn't go like that. I can tell you this, if you're a senior research officer, if you make investments in research, your sponsored research portfolio will grow. There is almost no correlation between that and licensing revenue, okay? So just something to keep in mind when you're having these discussions about, how to negotiate deals, blah, 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 okay? All right. Industry engagement requires highly skilled people to work. You're going to have to pay them more. So the old days, right back in the 80s, most sponsored research folks were assigned by department. So Betty did chemistry, Bill did physics, Julie did math, okay? That model should go away as it relates to industry-sponsored research. You need to have dedicated people doing industry-sponsored research that have a higher skill set than your people doing government contracting and awards. You need to partner them with the IP folks who are going to make more money than your director of sponsored research. Okay? So if you're a public university and it's in the paper, right? All salaries in the paper, right? Your IP folks are going to make more money. If you want to be successful in that space, hire really good people to do it, because you need them if you want to negotiate with companies, because you need to know how to navigate the gray. It's not black and white like it is government contracting. Government contracting is pretty simple. It's black and white. Here are the rules. This is what you do. Industry agreements are not that way. Licensing is not that way. So you need to, my hair used to be black, for those of you who used to know me, right? I have 3 kids now. I'm smarter than I am. I think I'm smarter now than I was 20 years ago, okay? I used to be a program officer at NSF, and I was really black and white. I was actually kind of a pain in the tail, to be honest with you, all right? And I remember I went to the University of North Carolina to negotiate funding an electron microscope, and the dean banged on the table and pointed at me. And you know what? He was right, and I was wrong. I was arrogant, because I thought I was the government, I was the government, and I'm here to tell you what to do, all right? I'm gray now, and I think I have a little bit better understanding of, nuancing. And that's what you need with people who do industry engagement, people who know how to navigate the gray. All right. Know the difference between partners, transactors, and antagonists. The problem with universities in working with companies are that we're kind of schizophrenic. So here's a picture of Boeing. Boeing has a great facility in Charleston. They made a $5 million investment at the University of South Carolina. The University of South Carolina wants to be a partner of Boeing's. All right? Now, I will tell you, they are not one of their strategic universities, but they are doing more work with them, and that's great for the University of South Carolina. They want to be a partner, not a transactor. Most of our industry university engagement is transaction. Hey, you do some good work, or can we use your testing facility for something? We'll give you $30,000. Okay? This is a quote from the Columbia Business Journal that I get, and I don't know if you all can read this. I almost screamed when I read this. This is an article about biomedical sciences, and what it says is this. In other words, researchers and physicians have traditionally toiled away in labs to produce miraculous discoveries, only then to essentially give them away to pharmaceutical companies, often to big pharma, which earn trillions of dollars from that work, right? So companies are evil, okay? I know the people that work in companies, the ones I interact with, they're not evil people. They're not. They're trying to make money for their companies, and they want to work with you, and they want you to help them make money, okay? Yes, and you want them to invest in your facilities and your universities. So we have this kind of schizophrenia. If there's a little bit of success between university and industry engagement, that's great. But if there's a lot, then people question it. Most of y'all are state schools. If you have a faculty member who gets a licensing royalty check for $10 million, somebody in the local newspaper is going to write about it and say, they're a state employee. Why are they getting $10 million? My husband works at DHEC, and he filed a patent, and they licensed it. He didn't get $10 million. Why is Dr. Jones from the university getting $10 million? So we have a little bit of this schizophrenia. This is from a 2009 New York Times article, and the reason I put this up there is I thought the students looked really menacing, right? Harvard Medical School and Ethics Quandary. That's the title. And basically the students were saying there's too much industry influence at the medical school. So, do you want to work with industry or do you not? And how do you manage that? And that's a challenge. All right. I put this up here. It was late last night. I had 1 or 2 slides I wanted to add. This is one of them. So for those of us old enough to remember Saturday Night Live, right? Cheeseburger, 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 Pepsi, Pepsi, Coke, right? Right? No Coke, right? Pepsi, 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 right? Okay. The point here is this. Companies will do a visit to your campus. You'll arrange it. The people in philanthropy are great at this. They'll arrange to have a team of folks come to visit your campus. And I've seen this happen all the time. A university will put together a series of presentations about how great they are, how they're world class. In this area, in this area, in this area. We do all these things and we're all great in everything. All right? Have you ever stopped and asked the question, what is it that you as a company need to be successful that we can potentially help you with? Okay? So, if you want a chicken sandwich, you couldn't get it here, right? Right? You couldn't get it, right? You got a cheeseburger, right? If you wanted a special hamburger, you couldn't get it here. You got a cheeseburger. Don't let your university be a cheeseburger. okay? Listen and then see if you can help them. And you know what the best part is? If you can't, tell them that you can't. Tell them, you know what? We're pretty good in this area, but if you really want to know who's best at this or better at us than this, go talk to so-and-so, my colleague at this institution. They actually will appreciate that. All right, I'm going to try to wrap up because I'm out of time. This is the Fraunhofer Institute in Boston. There's about 13 of them in the United States. If you're not familiar with the Fraunhofers, it's a German model for how they do cradle-to-grave development of technology from universities to Max Planck to Fraunhofers to companies. We don't do this in the U.S. We don't have an industrial policy. You could argue that we should, but we don't. And if you don't have a Fraunhofer model in your community, you should look at those because I think it's worthy of consideration. All right. I also put this up here about principal partnerships. I believe that university-industry collaborations are good, but a lot of people don't. And so, conflict of interest is a big deal, all right? And there's always going to be issues, but they can be managed. All right? I'm going to end this with faculty. So the traditional view of university-industry relationships is that there's government, industry, and university. In reality, it's faculty, government, industry, university. Faculty members have their own agenda. It can be consistent with yours, but it may not be. And you need to keep that in mind. A lot of times, the only people that know the whole story on a university-industry collaboration is the faculty member. All right? Government cares about university-industry collaborations. States are important here. A lot of states are doing some interesting things. And then I'm going to just finish this up on budgeting, okay? Do not give a company a federal budget. They don't understand overhead rates and tuition, and if you give them a budget with that, shame on you. Give them a budget they understand, okay? I get my oil change, and there's that $2 shop fee, and I hate it, right? I don't care about the shop fee. What are you going to charge my Visa card, okay? So think about how you do budgeting, all right? And then finally, I want to wind up with this. 3 great coaches, right? Ray Tanner, John Calipari, and Dan Mullen. On the football field, if the defensive safety looks over, right, or the linebacker looks over at the coach and does this, what does that mean? What does that mean? He doesn't know what the hell to do, right? Right? That's bad. You want your defense to be in sync. These are the leaders of their teams. At your institution, the senior research officer should set the tone for industry engagement. The people that work for that person should know that person's comfort level, okay? If they don't, you need to communicate it. What is your comfort level as a senior research officer, the provost, or the president? If you don't tell the people that are the transactors in the IP office, then they don't know what to do. They're going to be risk averse. So keep that in mind. Okay, the UIDP is a great group. I don't have time to tell you about it. We have a meeting coming up at the University of Tennessee if you'd like to come. If you'd like to learn more about how to work with companies, we're going to do a workshop here in Atlanta, December 2nd and 3rd, over 2 days, so we don't have to talk fast. Okay? So with that, I want to thank you. We have a LinkedIn group, and there's our website, and I look forward to hearing your questions. So thank you. Yeah, so I've listed some schools there. I mean, I think overall, look, there are some schools that have great industry engagement programs, and they're recognized. I think Georgia Tech is recognized. It's right here in the Southeast. Illinois has a great program. Texas has a great program. Carnegie Mellon has a great program, but there's reasons for that, and they didn't happen overnight, okay? So, and I apologize. I thought this clock was till 8:35, so I apologize for going over. So I'll hang around if you all want to ask me any questions, and once again, thank you for having me today.